that I don't know of a job that's more dependent on others than being an athletic director. You better have support of your president and your board. You better hire tremendous coaches. They better recruit outstanding young men and women who are students and athletes. But none of that works if you don't have the support of people who are willing to go beyond their jobs and families and make a commitment to your program and your vision.
Welcome to Inside the Coaching Mind, conversations on leadership, coaching, and team building. Your host, Terry Pettit, led the University of Nebraska Cornhusker volleyball team from 1977 to 1999 and coached Nebraska's first ever national championship in 1995. Today, Coach Pettit mentors coaches, authors books, and presents to corporations and businesses on leadership and team building. In Terry's interview with Creighton Director of Athletics Bruce Rasmussen, they talk about his talent in identifying extraordinary coaches, as well as his ability to build relationships that help develop facilities that have allowed the Creighton Athletic Department to compete at the highest levels. Bruce also talks about the challenges that Creighton's men's basketball program faced with potential NCAA violations. I'm Dave Young, producer of the podcast. Thanks for joining us. Here's Coach Pettit.
Our guest today is a great friend, Bruce Rasmussen, who for several years was the women's basketball coach at Creighton University, and for 27 going on 28 years has been the director of athletics. He's on the Hall of Fame at Creighton. Creighton has had more growth both in the institution and the athletic department during Bruce's tenure than at any other time. And Bruce just recently announced that on August 16th, he will be stepping down as director of athletics. I guess my first question would be, what will we be doing on August 17th?
I think I'll still be working for Creighton, but I'll be more Jesuit. The Jesuits take a vow of poverty. They expect us to live it. And the Jesuits like to not have to pay a lot and yet get help. And on August 17th, more than likely, I'll be continuing to help Creighton, but at a pay that they love.
Will you still be in the athletic department?
I'm not leaving Omaha, and I'll help Creighton in any way I can. It's just that I won't have that formal responsibility on a day-to-day basis.
Well, Bruce, we talked. I tried to rendezvous with you about, I suppose, a month ago, because I knew you were going up into Colorado. You know, in Japanese baseball, they have what's called a walkabout, where in the middle of a season, a manager can takes a sabbatical and disappears into the mountains in Japan, and then comes back. I kind of sense that this is something that you have done fairly regularly, but you went up and hiked somewhere in the mountains in northern Colorado. I'm not sure where, but a lot of reflecting had to go on in that hike. And what were the main themes?
Well, first of all, I think in a job like mine, and in a lot of people's jobs, they get so busy that they don't take time to get alone and think. And you know some of my background. And when I was in college, I wrote a term paper on Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau was very attractive to me with his philosophy and his thought process. But Walden Pond, he went to the woods to live deliberately. He said to front only the essential facts of life and not discover, when he came to the end of his life, that he had not lived. And I think we all need to take time on a regular basis to get alone with our thoughts and to think about a lot of different things, what we're doing that we should be doing, what we're doing that we shouldn't be doing, but to take time to be introspective and to get in deep thought ourselves. And, I'm going to be 72 years old in a month. And right now I'm blessed with pretty good health. I tell people I feel a lot better than I look. But I have always, since I was in high school, I've been a person that's gone to the mountains and am not uncomfortable being in the mountains by myself. And it's given me time to really reflect, often I'll take a book and read. But I think those pauses in our life allow us to make better decisions. And so when I went, I really wanted to think about, I don't know, as a basketball coach, we're pretty simple. We only have 5 people on the floor at a time. It's a lot less complicated than, for instance, football. But I always said life is kind of like a basketball game, where early in a game and early in your life, you're into advancement and acquisition. You know, you want to be successful. You've got some thoughts on what you should do. But we have a halftime where we stop and we reflect and we look at what happened in the first half. And that half might not be in the middle of your life. It might be when you're 70 years old, but you think about what went well. And early, you're into advancement and acquisition. You're trying to advance in your career. You're trying to advance in a game. And you're trying to acquire. And you're acquiring knowledge, but you're also acquiring a family, a house, possessions, and so forth. At halftime, you stop and you reflect. What went well in the first half? What adjustments do we need to make? Where were we right? Where were we wrong? What do we need to do in the second half? As you get closer to the end, it's, how do I want to finish? What kind of a legacy do I want to leave? How do I want to be remembered? And I just felt that there's so many things going on in Division I athletics right now, and they probably need a more contemporary vision than mine. And I'm not the sharpest tool in the box. And I've been a plotter. I've felt like I've had to outwork people. I had to get in early, and I had to just plug away. And I had to be all in. When I came to Creighton and women's basketball coach, we had no scholarships, we had no budget, we had no assistant. We were everybody's homecoming. And then when I became the athletic director, that was my personality. That's what worked. And as a result of that, there are a lot of things that you probably should have more of a priority for that I didn't. I wasn't a great dad. I wasn't a great husband. My wife carried a lot of that load. And as my kids have spread out, and a lot of them have an affinity for the mountains, so they're going in that direction. But it's a time where I'm not sure now that I want to be all in at Creighton. I want to be involved with Creighton. I want to be involved with Omaha, but I'm not sure that I, at this time, am as passionate about being all in, because there are other things that I would like to do. And that was really my thought process when I went to the mountains.
So you had not shared with anyone that you were going to step aside as athletic director before you went to Colorado?
That's correct.
Wow. This is kind of a strange question. When I dream at night, and I dream a lot, I always dream that I'm back coaching at Nebraska and John Cook hasn't recruited because he knew he was leaving, and there's no talent on the team, and I'm just really angry. Do you dream as a coach or as an AD, or what do you dream?
Well, you know, I can't remember what I had for breakfast. So when I wake up, I can't remember what I dreamt. But, you know, it's interesting you mentioned that, because there was a time in my life, I know when people look at this body, they think I must have been a multi-sport stud and as an athlete. But, you know, I was a marginal athlete. And a lot of my dreams for years were that I'm out on the floor and not being successful in a sport. And that I would wake up a lot where I was a failure on the court, the basketball court, or in track or whatever. And as a coach, I used to wake up a lot with those types of thoughts where, boy, we're getting embarrassed, we're getting beat. And so you'd like to think that your dreams were always positive, and mine weren't. But I haven't had those dreams lately.
Yeah, I think daydreams are positive. Night dreams, in my night dreams, I'm always unprepared.
Yep.
I'm either going to chemistry class and I haven't done the assignment, or we've got a game and for some reason I didn't come up with a game plan. But both of us are interested in poetry. You shared with me many years ago one of your favorite poems, and I'm going to read it here, by E. E. Cummings. It's called Buffalo Bills. Buffalo Bills defunct, who used to ride a water smooth silver stallion and break 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons just like that. Jesus, he was a handsome man. And what I want to know, how do you like your blue-eyed boy, Mr. Death? That's probably going to throw our listeners a curve. But tell me what you like about that poem, Bruce. I mean, I think it's a wonderful poem.
Well, it's a companion to another E.E. Cummings poem called Warty Bliggins the Toad. I don't know if you've ever read that.
I'm not familiar with that one.
Warty Bliggins the Toad is basically, the poem is about this toad that thinks he's the center of the universe. The universe revolves around him and was created for his benefit. And I think those two poems keep you humble, you know. I don't want to get too spiritual, but the two most important commandments in the Bible are, the first is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul. And the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. They're about relationships with your God and relationships with others. And I think both those two poems, if you focus on them, they force you to be intentional about what's most important. And you can get carried away in athletics and when you're in the spotlight, and you can get carried away about your importance, and you can get misdirected in terms of what's most important in life. And Buffalo Bill was a stud, you know. He threw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 clay pigeons just like that, and Jesus, he was a handsome man. But when you face your maker, what's going to be most important? And the two things that are going to be most important are your relationships with your Lord and Savior, and your relationship with others. And that's Warty Bliggins the Toad, too. We get to the point where we think the world revolves around us, and our focus is in-focused. And both those poems force you to, at least when you stop and think about it, to think about, have a better reflection on what is most important in your life and what will be, and what kind of legacy will you leave and how you will be remembered.
And one of the challenges of likeness and image is they push people in another direction.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, with names, images, and likenesses, I mean, it's got many layers, and some of the layers are good, but there are a number of layers that the unintended consequences aren't good. But I think we focused on the wrong side of names, images, and likenesses. And I think part of our responsibility as coaches and as administrators or people involved in sport is, obviously we want to improve whatever sport we're working with. We want our athletes to improve individually and as part of the team to the best of their interest, abilities, and desires. And it isn't just abilities, the desire is a big part of it. But we also, if at the college level or at any level, if we're involved in sport and that's all we're doing, then we shouldn't be coaching. We should also be using athletics intentionally to help better prepare people to be better leaders in their families, in their businesses, in their communities. And with names, images, and likenesses, a lot of people have focused on the monetary side of it. We've become too monetized in sport. But the other side of it is we have to be more intentional in educating our student athletes in financial management, in brand development, in taxations, the implications of taxation, and so forth. And by doing that, if we are indeed going to do that, and it's a primary part of names, images, and likenesses, is the education part of it. And if we do that, then we are better at preparing our young men and women to be better leaders in their families, businesses, and communities. The problem is, where is the focus going to be? And we get so much more into that, you know, the issue of Warty Bliggins the Toad, that the world revolves around me, and what can I do to better monetize myself and my talents and my image. And we're less concerned about the family, your teammates, your sport. You're less concerned about others. That's a real exposure to me.
Right. There obviously are some good things. You have people, particularly I think in basketball and football, that come from low-income families, barely have enough to even feed themselves sometimes in college, and it's going to provide a better situation for them. It's certainly, I was always thankful I was in a head count sport, because when you're in track and field and you're adjusting who gets what each year, it certainly can lead to some hard feelings. And, you're going to have some athletes that are making significant monies, and most athletes making very little. The other thing that wasn't around when you and I were coaching is the portal. It used to be that you probably couldn't transfer to a team in your own conference, and if you went anywhere, you had to sit out a year. I would have thought that there might have been a middle ground there. For example, if a coach left, that you could leave without having to sit out, or if a coach was convicted of an NCAA violation or abuse by somebody in the department. But now it seems like we're kind of pushing coaches into more of a managerial role than a coaching role, kind of a general manager.
The transfer rule and the transfer, even the process, there's a lot of layers to it. And it's why it took so long for some legislation to come forward. What we're seeing from the courts right now is the courts are very favorable to the student athletes. So whenever you try to put any kind of guardrails in, whether it's academics or whether it's transferring or whether financial or benefits, they've been challenged in the courts, and in essence, a lot of the times the guardrails have not been supported. So with the one-time transfer, what it's done is it's completely changed, especially at the Division I level, but it's completely changed the recruiting and the retention and the development process. And I've talked to a lot of coaches, not just basketball coaches, but there were some sports where you could transfer and be eligible immediately, but basketball, volleyball weren't two of those sports. But I've talked to a lot of coaches that are completely changing now the way that they recruit. You've got college coaches that are not looking at high school kids at all. You've got some that are only looking at the very obvious high school kids, and a lot of those are going to fall through the cracks because they're saying, listen, I can go and take a one-time transfer. And I have seen them play at the level they're going to play at college. I've seen them play against the competition they're going to play in college. And if they do transfer, I now have leverage over them because it's a one-time transfer. They can't transfer again without severe penalty, where if I get an incoming high school student athlete, I have to be real careful in a lot of areas. They can be an outstanding athlete and have success at my school, but another school could come in and say, well, your role is going to be different. We're going to feature you more. We can provide more resources for you with names, images, and likenesses. And so there's a real concern by a lot of coaches with high school kids. One, are they going to be able to make the transition? And two, I have to manage them more than I have to coach them.
Right.
And I had a coach that I highly respect that says, the first year that you have an athlete, the name on the back of the jersey typically is more important than the name on the front of the jersey. And as they are at your institution, as they develop friendships and relationships, then the name on the front of the jersey becomes more important. But we're seeing with one-time transfers that we're seeing less of that. Our goal has always been to recruit, retain, develop, and graduate outstanding student athletes. But one-time transfers made it more difficult to retain them. And if you can't retain them, you can't develop them. And if you can't develop them and retain them, you obviously can't graduate them. So it's changed the focus dramatically. We saw 1,700 kids in men's basketball in the in Division I in the transfer portal. There are only 1,100 opportunities available for them. And so they get misguided by themselves or their parents or whoever it is that they listen to. It could be their AAU coach or club coach. And it's just changed the dynamics of college athletics.
Right. Bruce, you're one of the very few athletic directors that I've seen that has been able to wear several hats and do them all well. You part of your role has been to hire, fire, and in some cases mentor coaches. You've been a major fundraiser for the athletic department. Even those two roles, I don't see it. I don't think this is a position for one person anymore. That it takes a multitude of talents to do that. You were also able to develop relationships with people who could get things done in Omaha that allowed you to develop the Quest Center and TD Ameritrade Park and facilities that Creighton could never have afforded themselves, but has had the opportunity to use for tremendous benefit. When I look out on the horizon, there are not many people that can do all those things. So, I guess who's hiring the next AD at Creighton?
Yeah,
Are they aware that it's this complex?
I think they are. And the reality is I haven't been doing it by myself for a number of years. I've got a tremendous staff. And the exciting thing for me, and it's what made it easier for me, the exciting thing for me is I think I've got an unbelievable staff and a lot of young, talented staff, much more talented than me. And they've been much more involved in a number of those things. But
let me interrupt you here.
Yeah.
Those young, talented staff don't go into Ruth Scott and ask for $1 million.
Yeah.
I mean, she wants the people like Bill and Ruth and David Sokol. They want to hear from Bruce Rasmussen.
Yeah.
So I mean, you have to have somebody with your cachet doing this.
Well, you have to wear a multiplicity of hats. There's no question about that. And there's no question that the athletic director job has changed. You know, when I first became athletic director, it was not uncommon for coaches that maybe were past coaching to go into administration. And now it is so complex and there's so many layers and you do have to split it out. But the person that's at the head has to be able to at least have a better understanding of each of those buckets, as you might put it, you know, whether it's fundraising, whether it's hiring, whether it's development, whether it's mentoring. And I've said that I don't know of a job that's more dependent on others than being an athletic director. You better have support of your president and your board. You better hire tremendous coaches. They'd better recruit outstanding young men and women who are students and athletes. But none of that works if you don't have the support of people who are willing to go beyond their jobs and families and make a commitment to your program and your vision. Because even at schools where they generate a lot of money because of their football media contract and their football gate, they still are very dependent upon others. So I'm not sure there's a position more dependent upon others than being an athletic director. And as we...
What is the talent that speaks to that? I mean, what you're really describing is almost an evangelist.
Yeah, and I'm going to go back to a poem, and I think you've heard me use this poem before, but it's The 6 Men of Indostan. To learning much inclined, went to see the elephant, though each of them were blind. You've heard that poem and you've read it. And we draw conclusions based on our level of information. And I think everybody, or the majority of people, try to draw logical conclusions based on their level of information. But the poem starts where the first blind man grabbed the tail and thought the elephant was very much like a rope. One grabbed the ear and thought it was like a fan. And all six drew logical conclusions based on their level of information. But the Pullmans, though each were partly in the right, all were in the wrong because they didn't see the entire elephant. And the elephant has become so much more complex than it was 30 years ago. And so it's much more difficult to be an athletic director that has an understanding of all of those different aspects. But I do think that it is valuable because we forget, as we've monetized the sport and sports, we forget that our primary purpose is to serve those young men and women who come to your institution. Their job isn't to serve us. Our job is to serve them, and they need to be the focus. And I think sometimes now in administration, where we look for people who have a much better expertise and knowledge in fundraising and marketing and compliance, we lose perspective of what is most important. And I think it has helped me tremendously, number one, to be a marginal athlete and to understand the value of those that are not in the spotlight on a team, and understand the culture, and a lot of times the ability to narrow that gap between potential and performance of an individual and a team is more dependent upon the faithfulness, the loyalty, and dedication of those not in the spotlight. Those people that are there because of the love for the game, the passion for the game, the desire to be in a small group that's intensely focused on the same goals, not in terms of, well, I'm a star, I'm in the spotlight, I'm doing you a favor by being there, but also then from the coaching perspective, and understand how fragile a sport can be. And you should be judged more by the process and more by what you do with what you have than by results. And we keep score for a reason, but sometimes that dominates our decision process. So to see the elephant from the perspective of a student athlete and from the perspective of a coach, I hope we don't lose.
Bruce, have you ever had team members come to you and want to fire the coach?
Yes, when I was the coach. But well, yes, I have. And I think
and what was your first response when they come?
Well, my first response has always been the same, and that is there is a process you need to go through. Have you talked to the coach? And have you been complete, honest, and specific? And what did you get for a response? And before you come to me, you need to go to the coach. Because if you put the student athlete and you say, how would you feel if I thought you were not doing what you should be doing and I went outside before I communicated to you and I was complete, honest, and specific? I went to your mom and dad, or I went to the press, or I went to others. And so that process is two ways. And so we'll have a discussion about that. But I won't talk to them in any depth until they have communicated to me and I believe that they have met with the coach and been complete, honest, and specific.
And yet we see, or at least I see every day, situations where that has not been the response.
Yes.
Yeah. Plantation. I was a little surprised, at Stanford, and I realize this has no relationship to this, but at Stanford, they always refer to the farm, but because it was a farm. But I guess it's a word that I haven't heard used in so long, and we're referring to when the Creighton men's basketball coach, I don't know if it was after a game or something, used the word
game, yes.
Plantation. Talk about the dynamics of that. Were you initially surprised that there was that strong a reaction from the players? Where did you come out on that?
Well, first of all, again, when I made a lot of mistakes in coaching. Coaching's athletics is a game of mistakes. Coaches make mistakes, players make mistakes, officials make mistakes. But a lot of times when I made a mistake as a coach, I was looking at it from my perspective instead of the perspective of the student athlete. And Coach McDermott, I mean, one of the goals in literature is to take a set of statements and a set of words and to draw conclusions that are logical, not to take them out of context, but in the context of the bigger picture. And first of all, Coach McDermott called me immediately after he left the locker room, and he said, I don't know if I've ever used the word in my life. He comes from a farm in Omaha, but some athletes were bothered by it initially. And if you look at it from their standpoint, you understand that. But when he met with the athletes just in the small group, they felt that they could handle it internally, in spite of the fact they communicated why they were bothered by the term, why it offended them in some levels, but they wanted to handle it internally. When that became public, and then the reaction of a lot of the public to the players, there was a different pressure on the players. But what we tried to do is what I've tried to do always. You try to look at it from all different angles. You try to look at it from the perspective of Coach McDermott and his background and how he has treated his athletes and how he has the relationship he's had with his athletes, not only the current athletes, but his past athletes, how he's treated those on his team at this time, but also then you try to meet with them and understand why they were bothered by it. And I think as a result of it, it was unfortunate and it was a mistake. And in some people's minds, it was an egregious mistake. But in my mind, what we have to do is take that situation, and now we have to learn from it. And I think that Coach and I and others have listened better as a result of it. I think we've learned as a result of it. I think we have been more active in being much more understanding of biases and injustices that have happened. And so I don't know if we'll ever put it behind us, but I think it has changed us for the better.
Mm-hmm. And I was fortunate, and you to some degree, I'm sure as well, coached at a time where a lot of my mistakes nobody knows about.
Yes.
We just didn't have that much coverage. And what you hope is that over time, you've built enough trust with athletes that they look at the whole picture and they say, well, he didn't say the right thing to me today, but overall, I know he's in my, he supports what I'm doing. The last year and a half has been difficult on all of us. I have to think, I talked with you when you were first on the men's basketball committee. I think you were on for 5 years. You were the chair your last year. At some point during that time, we talked about the investigation that eventually touched Creighton, but it touched several basketball programs. I believe it touched Arizona, it touched Kansas. I don't know. You would have a better idea than I would. Were you aware that would have been, I don't know, 2015 or somewhere in there. Were you aware that it might impact Creighton at that time?
I was not. And again, I will tell you that often we draw our conclusions based on our level of information. And there's been a lot of information out about that particular series of events, and only one side of the story has been told in a lot of that. And there's an African proverb that says, until the lion is able to give his side of the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And there's another side of that story that hasn't been told, but when I was on the men's basketball committee, and the NCAA, you try to have a pure sport, regardless whether it's basketball or volleyball or football. And we try to keep it clean at the college level, and it's an attempt, but it's certainly, you're not going to have perfection. But what I found when I was on the men's basketball committee is, and again, there's a Chinese proverb that says, no matter how pure the lake is, if the stream flowing into the lake is polluted, the lake will eventually become polluted. And select sport, club sport, select sport. At one time, select sport meant something different. It meant that you were the creme de la creme. You were at the top. And we're going to provide opportunities for you so you can take advantage of that. Now, club sport in a lot of sports means that your parents have the financial ability to pay for you to be on a select team. Or it means that if you don't have the financial ability, you're talented enough that somebody else is providing that funding. And so it's particularly in men's basketball, because of the financial benefit for men's basketball. And compared to football, the lower number of people that you need to have in order to be successful. You know, if you got a couple outstanding basketball players, you can have a pretty good team with only a couple. You can't do that in football. Okay, in basketball, you can do that. So basketball, the feeder system into college athletics and college basketball specifically is really dirty. And there's some benefits to the finances and the lack of transparency, and there's certainly some negatives. There's a verse in the Bible says that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It doesn't say money is the root of evil, and it doesn't say the love of money is the root of evil. It's the root of all kinds of money. The more money that's there, the more potential there is for violations or for evil, and certainly there.
Let me get some clarification here. What is the lion's story? In this situation, what is the lion's story?
Well, in each of those circumstances, there's another side of the story of you're trying to lump all of these in the same bucket, and every one is specific to its own. And so there's things that I can't say, but with the NCAA, they're going to try to make sure that the institution looks at it from the NCAA standpoint to protect the brand and to maybe protect the school, and not from the individual standpoint. And there's a lot of situations where coaches have been unfairly criticized or penalized because they were doing something which it was completely legal, and in some ways demonstrated a loyalty and a trust. And those are two words we don't hear enough in today's age, but they were put in the same bucket as those that were more egregious. Sometimes, it's easiest to pick the lowest fruit. And I'm not saying this is an accurate statement, but I'm saying it was out there years ago, and you were probably coaching at the time when Jerry Tarkanian was at NLV, and Kentucky had some issues, and Jerry was quoted as saying the NCAA is so mad at Kentucky they put Morehead State on probation. But I think sometimes we have a tendency to put a lot of different circumstances into the same bucket, and each one is unique in its own. And as I'm aware of a number of institutions, some that you mentioned, and you hear the specifics of that particular school, they are different than the specifics at a different school, and
Sure.
Yet we have a tendency to lump them all into the same bucket.
Did you feel that the NCAA was fair in their report on Creighton?
Well, I think they were fair from their perspective. I think there's another point of view that hasn't been communicated, but the reality is, in the situation with the NCAA and Creighton, we proposed the penalties. The NCAA accepted our proposed penalties. And so the NCAA certainly, had they thought they were not strict enough, they would have added on to them. The question is, did we over-penalize ourselves? Because the penalties we are receiving are those that we self-imposed.
So Creighton self-imposed the two-year probation.
Yes.
I wasn't aware of that. That's good to clarify that. The one that is most baffling to me, and there's a book coming out about it by an editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education, was on North Carolina's running a class for 20 years where you didn't have to show up or go or do anything. And their argument was, well, there were a couple other kids that weren't athletes in this class, which to me is the equivalent of saying, my team broke into a convenience store and stole all kinds of food, but somebody else ran in and grabbed a case of beer, so we shouldn't be prosecuted. I think that's what the general public has has trouble figuring out, that if you have the right lawyers, I don't see how North Carolina could make that case with a straight face.
Well, and again, I understand that, and I've heard that from a number of people, and I feel that to a certain level. But the NCAA was in a tough situation because is it up to the NCAA to make a decision on whether a class is worthwhile or not, or is that an institutional decision? But in that particular case, about 60% of the participants in that class over the years were student athletes, but about 40% were non-student athletes. So if it were for student athletes only, it'd have been a different situation. But we can say that class was a joke. It's like offering pottery as a degree completion requirement. But that's not the NCAA's decision. It had to be the institution.
But Bruce, could you give money to basketball players as long as you gave money to 40% to the student body?
Well, it's to a certain level. There are things that you can do for student athletes that are financially beneficial if you make them available to all students. Whether all students take availability and use that is another issue. But for instance, to use this, your question is a great question, but we cannot provide transportation from the airport to our campus for our student athletes unless we offer that to all of the students. Now, if all of our student athletes take advantage of that and only 40% of the students take advantage of that, it's not a violation. So you get into the grayness of a lot of those. And while it doesn't make sense, I understand the position the NCAA was in with North Carolina, but it stinks. Even though they came to the conclusion, I think they had to be able to have it stand up in a court of law, the result stinks.
Yeah, I'm gonna run through some names here. I think one of your great talents is your ability to evaluate talent, and these are people that have worked at Creighton. And if you could just give me a brief summary on some of them, on what you felt their talent was and how they leveraged it. We'll begin with Dana Altman, who's a great friend of yours and is currently the head coach at Oregon.
Dana, first of all, is an outstanding human being, cares about his student athletes. He's more old school in his coaching, where you see a lot of coaches today that are more CEOs. They delegate a lot of responsibility to their staff. Dana dominates his staff, and he can be very demanding. And yet the reason that he connected with his student athletes was they knew he was all in. He was asking them to be all in, but they knew he was all in. And he's been successful as a result of that.
Right. Bob Warming, great soccer coach at Creighton, went to Penn State. He thought he was done. We thought he was done. He came back to his home in Omaha. Now he's the head coach at Nebraska Omaha.
Bob is one of the most prepared coaches of any sport that I've ever been around. And I mean, from all angles. When we interviewed Bob, he by far was the best interview I've ever had. And he has a way to relate to players and they to him. He's a great recruiter. Bob's Achilles heel is every 4 or 5 years he gets that itch that he's got to do something different. So when you look at Bob's career, we took advantage of it. Not only did we take advantage, he was at Charlotte and came to Creighton when we didn't have a soccer program. We didn't have a facility. We had nothing. But it was because was looking at the next thing. But that challenges Bob. So he needs to have a new situation. And so when you look, Bob went from Creighton to Fordham to Old Dominion to St. Louis to back to Creighton, and then to Penn State, and now to UNO. Outstanding coach, just a great coach. All aspects of the game. His Achilles heel is he has to have new challenges every 3 or 4 years, and that often involves a change in geography.
I'm going to say something now that I've said before publicly. I think Connie Yori is the best basketball coach that has ever coached at the college level in the state of Nebraska. Now, you don't have to concur with that.
I do.
But she was a warrior as a player. She was a warrior as a coach. I saw her up close when she first came to Nebraska, and there was no talent at all. And I saw how she handled that. Talk about what makes her great.
Well, Connie is one of the most competitive persons I've ever been around, and she was as an athlete at Creighton. And one of the advantages that we have on the women's side, and when Connie was at Creighton, we had 6 scholarships. You could have 15. We had no full-time assistants. But Connie was going to do whatever it took. It wasn't, I gave it my best shot. It was, I will find a way. But the way I challenged her in practice was I brought in male practice players, and they were former college basketball players. And I said, you're guarding Connie, and she's guarding you, and you don't take it easy on her. And she fought that, and she fought it by saying, I don't like what you're doing, but I'm going to kick their tail, and I'm going to dominate them on the other end. I gave it my best shot. It's not in my job description. Connie Yori was somebody who found a way.
But there are people that can do that as players. How does that translate into being a great coach?
Well, her background was in journalism, and so I think she's an outstanding communicator. But she's very, very intelligent. People talk about her athleticism. We talk a lot about what people accomplish. We don't talk enough about why they accomplished it. And Connie's extremely intelligent and a great communicator. And while she had a difficult time as a player to put herself in the position of some of the people on the team who weren't as athletic as her, I think in the process of coaching, I think she matured to have a much better understanding of that. But she could be tough and demanding and develop a toughness in her players and yet still be understanding. That was something that I learned more from her than she learned from me.
Yeah, when I watch Creighton play now, she'll be back in the shadows, but I can tell she's living with every point. And,
yes.
And I'm sure she's helping Coach Flannery. The last one I want to mention here is Kirsten Booth. I suppose a footnote to this question is, when is she going in the Creighton Hall of Fame?
We typically don't put active people in the Hall of Fame, so and hopefully she doesn't go in for a long time. But Kirsten, one of Kirsten's main talents, and again, she's someone who communicates well, and she really cares for her players. She has a great eye for talent, but where she's better than pretty much any other coach that we've had at Creighton or that I've observed is, I think sometimes, and I was a victim of this, sometimes we forget that the phrase is you play volleyball, you play basketball, you play football, and there has to be an element of play and joy in the process. And Kirsten is really good at that. She is very talented at making it a joyful experience. So the kids, while they are there are high demands put on players individually and as a group, there's still a joy to the process. And I think she's as good as I've seen at that. And so is Coach McDermott, by the way.
What's the deal breaker when you evaluate a coach? In other words, let's say they're very talented, they've been very successful, but what is the one quality that is going to take them out of the picture to ever coach for Bruce Rasmussen?
It's a great question. I don't know if there's one thing. Sometimes it's like that old Red Lobster commercial where there's unlimited shrimp and you finally put one on it and it breaks the entire platter. Often with coaches, it's not one issue, because if it is one issue, you have a profound grasp of the obvious. Often it's an accumulation of smaller things, but I put our staff into three buckets, and it's passion, intelligence, and character, but they have to be focused and intensely focused on serving the athletes, not having the athletes serve them. And we all say, welcome to the Blue Jay family, welcome to the Cornhusker family. And yet it's a lot easier to say than it is to live. And when I look at somebody's passion, it's what do they do that they don't have to do? And it doesn't have to be necessarily in their sport. What are they doing on campus? What are they doing in your department? What are they doing in the community? What are they doing with their family? What are they doing that they don't have to do? That's passion. And your athletes who do the best job of narrowing that gap between performance and potential are those that look at practice as a minimum job description. They go to practice, find out what they need to work on, then they go out on their own. That's passion. Things that I don't have to do that I'm willing to do. Intelligence is not just skill. We look at, a lot of times people say, well, intelligence, they equate it with talent. A lot of those kids that have been the most disappointing had unbelievable talent, but they didn't care for their teammates or their instincts in the sport. You see a good setter and she sees the game frame by frame. She sees it before others do. And she sees that the situations change depending upon the situation in the game or that particular set or the need of particular athletes. And so I think intelligence has a lot to do with instincts and vision and care for the person next to you and an understanding of the entire picture. And then character is, how do you represent yourself and your program and the university and your community? And so those are the buckets that I look at. And if you have enough shrimp on the platter, it typically is what makes, which causes a change.
Yeah, Coach Warming took my call this morning, even though he was getting ready to have his first practice. And I said, give me, I think I've got a lot of insight into Bruce, but he talked about this poem that's in the movie, The Mule.
Oh yeah.
The song. And I asked David, could we play this song? David said no, because you have to.
There's copyright infringement.
But it begins, don't let the old man in. I want to leave this alone. Can't leave it up to him. He's knocking on my door. It goes on. There's a stanza later that says, many moons I have lived, my body's weathered and worn. Ask yourself how you would be if you didn't know the day you were born. Ask yourself how you would be. And in my own life, I only know the day that I'm born when somebody takes a photograph of me. Yeah. Man, I age 30 years every time I look at a photograph. But that's a pretty meaningful song for you. And those we'll put. There's a YouTube video of that song, which we're going to put on our website next to this podcast so people can see it. But what is that? How does that impact you?
Well, and Bob sent me a framed picture of that, and because I told him why it was important to me. But the genesis of that is Clint Eastwood at age 89 was the feature. He was the director and the featured player in the movie The Mule, about an old guy who basically was not respect anymore because of his age. He was kind of yesterday's news, and he gets into the drug running business. But Toby Keith, who's a friend of Clint Eastwood, said, Clint, why are you still working? You own half of California. Why are you still making movies? Why are you still doing this? And he said, I don't want to let the old man in. Every day when I get up, my goal is to not let the old man in. And Toby Keith wrote the song based upon that communication with Clint Eastwood. But as a coach, every day when I went to practice, I challenged our players and said, I wasn't saying, well, we're going to play Nebraska and we've got to be better than them. It was, what are we going to do today, individually and as a part of a team, to be better today than we were yesterday? And so that's our goal in practice, is to be better today than we were yesterday. The process is important. But where there's a disconnect between players and coaches is when the players see that you are asking that of them and they see you coasting, you not getting better, you not accepting the same challenge. So that's the challenge to me, and it's why I had it on my wall where I looked at it every day, is what am I doing today to be better than I was yesterday? What am I doing today to not let the old man in, not just physically, but mentally? And so that song meant a lot to me.
It basically says that our sense of purpose has to be in the future.
Yes.
I'm going to finish up here reading a poem, Bruce, that I don't know whether you read it or not, but it was in a book of selected poems that I wrote. It's called "Today We're Losing a Teacher."
Yep.
Today we're losing a teacher. Today we're losing someone who taught us the difference between the light in a Renoir and the light in a Monet. Today we're losing someone who taught us about the shock of recognition when Nathaniel Hawthorne felt when he first met Herman Melville. Today we're losing someone who said there's a difference whether or not you spell gray with an E or an A. Today we're losing the person who taught us about the golden rectangle and how pleased we are when we come upon a nautilus shell or lines in just the right proportion. Today we're losing the person who introduced us to E.E. Cummings and these lines from Robert Frost that begin, "One ought not to care as much as you and I when the birds fly round the house and seem to say goodbye. But of course we do care." That's his point. Today we're losing a teacher. Today we're losing someone who was willing to teach us the fireman's carry, a jab step, a somersault at the end of the pool. Today we're losing a sponsor for the letter club, the Latin club, the student council, the band. At the university, graduates wait with diplomas, eager to become engineers, attorneys, entrepreneurs, and MBAs. Life awaits them with guaranteed contracts, stock options, and cars with exotic names. But who's going to teach us why the boy in Faulkner's short story refuses to shoot the bear? Who's going to introduce us to language that goes crazy? Who's going to teach us the innate beauty in mathematics? Who's going to tell us about Crazy Horse and Willa Cather? Who, when we've done our best and things don't go our way, when we've studied hard and don't pass the test? Who, when we get the open shot in the big game and take it and miss? Who's going to put their arm around us and tell us everything will be okay? Today, we're losing a teacher. Well, Bruce, we're not losing you. I've got a suspicion that that there's going to be an office in that same building, and that the next athletic director is going to be calling your name a lot. And I certainly have appreciated your friendship. I would make this footnote that I think you loved taking retreads from Nebraska. Coach Osborne, myself. I noticed your men's golf coach Judd was at Nebraska. You've had a sports psych for Nebraska. I thought if your men's basketball coach ever left, it wouldn't surprise me if Tim Miles showed up at Creighton. But thank you so much for opening up to us today.
Well, thank you. And that poem was powerful, intense, emotional. That's the value of poetry. It communicate so much in so few words. And one of the many differences between you and me, and I've learned so much from you, is that you have an ability to write that. I only have an ability to read it and try to understand it. So I greatly appreciate our relationship and our friendship, but especially the mentorship.
Well, have a great day, and I hope your family gets to see more of you.
They will, and maybe they'll decide that that's not a good thing, but I'm looking forward to that. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Inside the Coaching Mind with your host, Coach Terry Pettit. Be sure to subscribe in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to have you leave a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your friends by tweeting, posting on Facebook, emailing, or just talking about it over a cup of coffee. All the ways to subscribe are posted on terrypettit.com. And don't forget to look for our Facebook group, Inside the Coaching Mind with Terry Pettit. I'm Dave Young. We'll talk to you next time for the next episode of Inside the Coaching Mind.